هلا انك تقدر اعمل لك كوبوست. هل راح تسجل بال So, should we start? I think so. Yeah. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the fourth session of the seminar Globalization, Colonialism.
صباح الخير جميعا وأهلا وسهلا بكم في هذه المحاضرة العولمة والاستعمار والتحرر الذي تنسقها كلية إبراهيم أبو اللغد في جامعة بيرزيت في فلسطين.
ولما نبدأ بس يعني ملاحظة تقنية للي بيحبوا يتابعوا هاي الجلسة حتكون باللغة الإنجليزية، فاللي بيحبوا يتابعوا اللغة العربية في ترجمة موجودة متوفرة بفضل مترجمتنا مدار. معنا بتكون اختاروا قناة اللغة العربية، الضغط على الكرة الأرضية الصغيرة اللي بتبين عندكم تحت الزوم. و so English again. As in the previous sessions, the seminar aims.
كما كنا نقول في الجلسات السابقة، وبطلت أسمع. راح الصوت
راح الصوت كله.
شكرا لك فيروز. المفروض هلأ زبط. إذا دعوني أعيد. هذه الجلسة اليوم، فإذا في هذه الجلسة تقوم هذه الجلسة بالحديث عن الاستخراجية الإسرائيلية، الاستعمار الاستيطاني، الجغرافيا الاقتصادية والنفط مع لاله خليلي. ويشرفنا جدا أن تكون معنا الدكتورة لاله خليلي، وقد عملت كثيرا حول السياسات الولايات المتحدة تجاه الشرق الأوسط. قامت بنشر العديد من الكتب في هذا المجال، كان لدي الشرف سابقا بالتحدث معها، وتحدثت عن مواضيع كثيرة من ضمنها مثل الصوت مش كثير واضح. وأنا أعرف بأن موضوع اليوم مرتبط بتطوير وجزءا من كتابها القادم حول الاقتصاد العالمي. إذن دكتورة لاله، أهلا وسهلا بك وشكرا جزيلا لقبولك دعوتنا ولتكوني معنا اليوم.
You have around 40 to 50 minutes for the presentation, and
تقريبا
then
50 دقيقة للعرض، ومن ثم سوف نناقش. شكرا جزيلا. حسنا، ممتاز. شكرا جزيلا جميعا لكونكم هنا، وأنا أعتذر لعدم قدرتي على الحديث باللغة العربية. أستطيع القراءة باللغة العربية، أستطيع القيام بالكثير من الأمور باللغات، فأرجو معذرتي. يدوب أقدر أتحدث باللغة الفارسية وهي لغتي الأصلية، ولكن للأسف أتحدث اللغة الإنجليزية لفترة طويلة. ثانيا، أريد أن أشكركم لسماحي أن أكون معكم اليوم، وسبب اهتمامي للحديث معكم هو لأن المرة السابقة التي كنت فيها في فلسطين تحدثت مع مؤسسة إبراهيم أبو اللغد قبل عدة سنوات، تكن آخر مرة كنت هناك، ولكن كانت من المرات التي كنت هناك، والغرفة التي تحدثت فيها تشبه كثيرا المكان الذي يحدث فيه السيمينار. فأتذكر الآن، تعود لي ذكريات. وأردت أيضا قبل البدء أردت أن أعبر مناصرتي لكم. أعلم بأن هذه من أسوأ الأوقات لكم ولرفاقنا الفلسطينيين وأخوتنا وأخواتنا الفلسطينيون في غزة، وبالطبع لجميع من هم في سوريا ولبنان وبلدي إيران. فكلنا نعاني أعمال إسرائيل ونهضة الصهيونية والإمبريالية. وما أردت الحديث عنه اليوم هو عن إسرائيل واحتياجاتها للطاقة وما يقولوه لنا حول تاريخ إسرائيل. فسأبدأ الآن. جولدا مائير زارت إيران بصفتها وزيرة خارجية إسرائيل في شهر 7 1965. هبطت طائرتها الغير معلمة في الظلام في طهران، وتم نقلها إلى دار ضيافة خاصة في شمال طهران. كان مستشارو مائير حريصين على الترويج لزيارتها، ولكن الإيرانيين أصروا على إبقائها سرية. وفرت هذه السرية للشاه غطاء خلال فترة اضطرابات في قطاع النفط العالمي. كان من المتوقع أن تظهر إيران جبهة موحدة مع الدول العربية في مفاوضاتها مع شركات النفط الأوروبية والأمريكية التي كانت تسيطر على غالبية الإنتاج العالمي. في ذلك الوقت كانت الدول 5 كانت أمريكية و2 كانت بريطانيتيان، كانت مترددة لبيع النفط لإسرائيل علنا، خشية من إثارة غضب الدول العربية التي كانت تزداد نفوذا. ونظرا لأن سوق النفط الفورية لم تكن قد ظهرت إلا بعد أكثر من عقد من الزمان، قد كانت إسرائيل مصممة على إيجاد مورد موثوق للنفط الخام. تحدثت جولدا مائير مباشرة إلى الشاه واقترحت مشروعا مشتركا بين إيران وإسرائيل يتم بموجبه شحن النفط الإيراني على متن ناقلات إلى مدينة إيلات الساحلية الهادئة على خليج العقبة لتلبية احتياجات إسرائيل من الطاقة. ستكون إيلات إحدى محطات خط أنابيب كبير النفط القطر، ينشأ سرا ليمتد عبر إسرائيل من البحر الأحمر إلى عسقلان على البحر الأبيض المتوسط. ثم تنقل الشاحنات وناقلات أصغر حجما وخطوط أنابيب أضيق النفط داخليا إلى مصفاة حيفا. ما يهم الشاه هو فائض النفط الذي يشحن على متن ناقلات إسرائيلية إلى أسواق أوروبا. كانت جولدا مائير قد زارت رومانيا وحصلت على اتفاقية من بوخارست لشراء النفط، هذا الفائض من النفط الإيراني. كان الشاه مترددا في البداية بشأن اقتراح خط الأنابيب، لكن الأمور تغيرت مع إغلاق قناة السويس في بعد عامين. منحت الأزمة إيران الزخم الذي تحتاجه لتزويد إسرائيل بالنفط وبيعه للعملاء الأوروبيين عبر إسرائيل، وقد مكنها ذلك من تحقيق ميزة نسبية إلى منافسيها العرب بفضل انخفاض تكاليف النقل نتيجة عدم اضطرارها لنقل النفط حول رأس الرجاء الصالح. كلفت إيران بإجراء دراسة جدوى، وكان المسؤولان عنها هما فتح الله نفيسي من شركة النفط الوطنية الإيرانية، وفيليكس شينار الذي كان قد أنهى لتوه فترة رئاسته لبعثة التعويضات الإسرائيلية في كولونيا. في عام 1968 أسس البلدان شركة مشتركة باسم ترانز أزياتيك في سويسرا، واشتريا البنية التحتية لخط أنابيب أصغر قائم بالفعل من قبل بين إيلات وبئر السبع من مجموعة روثشيلد. كما طلبت ترانز أزياتيك ناقلات لنقل النفط بحراً. اجتمع هيرمان أبس من دويتشي بانك مع شينار ونفيسي في سويسرا لوضع اللامسات الأخيرة على خط الأنابيب الأكبر، حيث ضمنت حكومة ألمانيا الغربية سعر فائدة أعلى من قروض الأسواق المفتوحة. كان هيرمان أبس بنفسه أحد أقوى المصرفيين في الريخ الثالث، وبصفته رئيساً للقسم الخارجي في دويتش بانك كان مسؤولاً عن مصادرة الأصول اليهودية الأوروبية
was sent to unstitch his earlier handiwork. He was put in charge of the German restitution in Israel, and in that capacity had developed a cordial working relationship with Shinar. The Eilat Asqalon pipeline went into operation in the nationalization of oil. The loosening of the grip of the Seven Sisters and the coming Arab-Israeli war in 1973 opened up a space for independent traders to make deals with buyers and producers. The problem was how to get the oil from the Gulf to its buyers in Europe and the Americas while the Suez Canal was closed. As Iran did not want to be seen to be trading directly with Israel or shipping its oil through Israel to European customers, middlemen were needed. Enter Mark Rich, a Belgian-American commodities trader who foresaw the seismic transformation of the oil markets and decided to take advantage. Mark Rich's American business partner was Pincus Green, who had inked major metals contracts with Iran and spoke Persian, and he introduced Rich to Iranian oilmen. Rich began to cultivate a relationship with the oil technocrats and with the Shah himself, who took his skiing holidays in San Moritz, where Rich owned a chalet on the Cerveto slope. Rich managed to sign a long-term oil contract with Iran that secured his company Iranian crude at $5 per barrel for the duration of the deal, just as the price of oil was about to skyrocket from $3 to $11 a barrel. Rich then sought buyers who were not already in hock to the majors. Since the Suez Canal was still closed, Rich began negotiating independently with the Israeli government. The French bank Paribas financed Rich's large shipments of oil from Iran. The tankers unloaded their cargo at Eilat, with some of the oil making its way to Haifa and later Ashdod refineries. Rich's ships collected the excess at Ashkelon. I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, there was someone talking, sir. Okay. Rich's ships collected the excess at Asqalon and transferred the cargo directly to US and European buyers. Refineries, petrochemical industries, power plants, and governments made excellent customers for the Mark Rich and company trade in oil. Rich even bought substantial shipments of Iranian oil for the United States Defense Supply Center and shipped it through the Eilat-Asqalon pipeline. In some years, Rich sold more oil than some producing nations. Many years later, Rich told his biographer, Daniel Aman, that the pipeline had given him a big price advantage. The transport of Iranian crude through the pipeline was much cheaper than going all the way around Africa. Mark Rich became fabulously wealthy from the stealth trade through the Eilat and Asqalon pipeline. The deal also benefited Iran, whose oil was much more attractive to Europeans because of its lower freight markup. And Israel met its energy needs and bolstered its foreign reserves. Rich courted Iran even after the revolution had toppled the Shah. While the deals between the National Iranian Oil Company and the majors fell apart in 1979, it continued to honor its deals with Mark Rich, selling him around 70 million barrels of oil per year, which was a good deal of which made its way to the oil terminals at Eilat. In the 20 years he helmed his trading company, Rich sold Israel up to 20% of its annual oil needs. Revolutionary leaders in Iran were content with symbolic gestures of enmity against the little Satan, but never weaponized the oil trade with Israel. Things have changed now. Rich's lack of scruples in dealing with revolutionary Iran irritated chauvinists in the United States. Rudy Giuliani, who was then a federal prosecutor looking to make his name in New York, brought charges of trading with the enemy against Rich and Green in 1983. For 17 years thereafter, Mark Rich's face appeared on the FBI's most wanted posters. While evading extradition to the US, ensconced in his mansion in Lucerne or traveling to do business, Rich was guarded by former Mossad agents. Then, out of the blue, Bill Clinton pardoned both men on his last day as president in January 2001. Rich's ex-wife, Denise, had donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Democratic Party and to the Clinton Presidential Library. But more importantly, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and former head of Mossad, Shabtai Shavit, had both lobbied the Clinton administration on Rich's behalf. As Aman writes, Rich had organized contacts in places where Mossad had none. He offered money in situations where Israeli officials could not. Rich was dubbed a Sayan, or a helper to the intelligence agency. But far more important than the intelligence work had been Rich's delivery of oil. Even before the Israeli state was founded, energy politics influenced the relationship between the settlers of the Yishuv and the indigenous Palestinians. Between 1920, when Britain and France divided the Ottoman Empire's Arab provinces between them, and Israel's founding in 1948, the Nakba, the World Zionist Organization established a number of proto-governmental institutions for the Jewish settler community in Palestine. One of the earliest and most important among them was the Palestine Electric Company, the chief subject of Frederick Mayton's definitive history of energy and Zionist state building. British mandatory powers in Palestine granted Pinchas Rutenberg of Palestine Electric concessions for the construction of power plants and an extensive electricity grid. Rutenberg, who had been a veteran of the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917, and who would have a hand in founding organizations from the Haganah to the Palestine Airways, which later became El Al, Rutenberg planned to produce hydroelectric power, drawing from the Jordan River at its confluence with the Yarmouk River and the Auja River, which runs east-west from north of Jericho to the Mediterranean. His plan to expand north and exploit the Litani River, well within the Lebanese territory, for the same purpose, has continued to shape Israeli policy towards Lebanon, as we have seen even in the last couple of years, with Israel invading again and blowing up bridges over the Litani River because it wants control of the Litani. To produce hydroelectric power, this Zionist company claimed it needed to control extensive tracts of land in the river basins, including some of the most fertile farmland in Palestine proper, as well as chunks of territory across the Jordan River in Transjordan. The planned power grid crisscrossed the whole of the map of Palestine and would require the possession of land along the routes designated for the high-tension wires. The land acquired for the building of the power stations and the grid infrastructure was also used to build Jewish settlements. As in other countries, the production of energy went hand in hand with territorial control over geological features. rivers, seas, shorelines, as well as undulations of land that signaled the possible presence of oil reservoirs. Rutenberg's scheme received British approval and support, even as British officials acknowledged that the uneven development and asymmetric utilization of infrastructure that extended from the river to the sea gave, in the words of a British colonial official, a grip over the whole economic life of Palestine to the Jewish settlers. Palestinians, in turn, recognize the territorial ambition, economic importance, and political meaning of the electrification plans as foundational to the colonial project that was already beginning to displace them. In a series of protests and uprisings, starting in Jaffa in 1923 and spreading all over Palestine as the years went on, they resisted the expropriation of their land, the transformation in their lived environments, and the hostile settlements created on the Palestine Electric Company lands. In some places, Palestinians tried to challenge the monopoly of the company by setting up smaller diesel-operated generators. Others threatened sabotage. To sap Palestinian resistance, Rutenberg suggested deferring the large-scale hydroelectric project in Auja in favor of a diesel-fueled power station in Tel Aviv and Jaffa, and later a steam turbine in Haifa. The massive power plant at the confluence of the Jordan and Yarmouk rivers came online in 1932. Power was distributed unevenly, with Jewish residential and commercial consumers receiving almost all of the electricity. Nocturnal Tel Aviv was brightly lit. Jaffa wasn't. The labor used to construct the infrastructures was racialized, with Palestinian workers earning a fraction of the wages of the Jewish laborers. By 1948, Jewish settlers in Palestine constituted less than 40% of the population of the territory and owned only 7% of the land, but consumed 90% of the 250,000 kilowatt hours sold by the Palestine Electric Company. The widening economic and political gaps forced by this energy infrastructure has continued to shape Israel's relationship with the Palestinians. Within the nascent Israeli state's borders, even as Jewish settlements enjoyed extensive infrastructures, the vast majority of Palestinian citizens who continued to live in neighboring villages were denied access to those services. As one Palestinian council member in Nasirah complained, the government supplies every new Jewish colony with roads, electricity, and water before anyone moves in. Why would electricity poles and water bypass Arab villages but leave them dark and dry? The unequal allocation of energy resources inside Israel has continued until today. Official government Judaization policies in Naqab and Jalil, where Palestinian citizens of Israel are concentrated, have translated into Kafkaesque housing policies that at the very least circumscribe new construction in or expansion of Palestinian communities. These policies have been reinforced by deliberate denial of access.
She's on campus now, نسيت عنها.
اليوم she's on campus.
These policies have been reinforced by deliberate denial of access to vital infrastructures, including electricity or water, in both settled and Bedouin Palestinian communities. Being connected to the Israeli electricity grid, however, has its own disadvantages. Only a few days after the occupation of East Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza in 1967, Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan remarked, if Hebron's electricity grid comes from Israeli central grids, and we are able to pull the plug and cut them off, this is clearly better than 1,000 curfews and riot dispersals. In November 1967, Israeli Military Order 159 placed all electricity infrastructure in the occupied territories under the control of Israeli military administration. Today, Palestinians in West Bank produce only 14% of their own electricity and are dependent on Israel for the rest. Before 1967, Israel regularly denied Palestinians within its borders access to electricity. After 1967, the occupied territories were made deliberately reliant on Israeli infrastructures that could be switched off at the flick of a switch. One by one, independent power plants in West Bank and Gaza have been shut down, and Palestinian communities have been forcibly attached to the Israeli power grid, which we've seen the effects of in Gaza, and in the way that we're seeing that it is a genocidal cutting off of power. What is interesting is Golda Meir was neither the first nor the last Israeli prime minister to secretly fly to Iran. Before the Iranian monarchy was overthrown in 1979, every single Israeli prime minister, bar one, visited Tehran. David Ben-Gurion inaugurated such visits in 1961 as part of his periphery plans to build alliances with non-Arab states, which were Iran, Ethiopia, and Turkey, that encircled the Arab world. After Ben-Gurion, Levi Eshkol, Golda Meir, Yigal Allon, Yitzhak Rabin, and Menachem Begin, and almost every Israeli foreign and defense minister flew secretly to Iran. The only prime minister not to pay his respect to the Shah was a Moshe Sharet, and he was imposed for less than a year in the mid-1950s. The vast majority of these visits were related to Israel's desperate need to secure energy resources and energy supply routes. In the half-century-long Israel search for hydrocarbons, the Sinai was the byword. The southward-pointing Sinai wedge separates or joins the African and Asian continents. Sharm el-Sheikh sits at the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula, where the Gulfs of Suez and Aqaba meet to form the Red Sea. In the early 20th century, Imperial British geologists produced intricate survey maps of the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern shorelines they controlled, searching for reservoirs of water and eventually petroleum. Writing for the Geological magazine in 1940, two geologists described the geography of the region as an arc of exploration for petroleum that ran from Syria, Palestine, and Sinai to Iraq, Iran, and Arabia, all the way to Oman. Explorations in Palestine and later Israel, however, proved largely futile. The absence of petroleum inside the 1949 armistice line must have been galling to the Israeli leaders, given the relative proximity of Saudi Arabia or Iraq or even the Sinai, where British companies had discovered reserves of oil in the late 1940s. Arab rulers in the Gulf balked at selling oil to the fledgling Israel. In its early years, the Israeli economy was dependent on agriculture, and oil-fueled Israeli desalination plants used to irrigate water-intensive farm products produced for export. Anglo-Iranian oil company subsidiaries in Kuwait and Qatar sent secret tankerfuls of oil to their refinery in Haifa, which they finally sold to Israel in 1958. Israel's energy needs and dependence on secret and unreliable sources was considered a national security concern, and for Ben-Gurion, it was a matter of life and death, the publicizing of which could expose a significant Israeli vulnerability. Sinai tantalized not only with its strategic command over the Suez Canal, the Gulf of Aqaba, and the Strait of Tiran, but also with its petroleum potential. In 1956, after Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company, high-ranking officials from Israel, Britain, and France secretly met in Sèvres, France, to plot the invasion of Egypt. France and Britain both wanted to regain control of the canal. Ben-Gurion saw in the imperial anxiety over the Suez Canal an opportunity to expand Israeli territory beyond the 1949 armistice line. His ambition was not only the overthrow of Nasser, but a wholesale transformation of the geopolitical map of the region, including the division of Transjordan between the monarchical Iraq and Israel, resettling of Palestinian refugees outside the borders of Palestine, the expansion of Israel north into the Lebanese territory to the Litani River, and control over Sinai. Basically, what we're seeing right now is Netanyahu trying to do what Ben-Gurion dreamed of doing in the 1940s. None of this would be possible without a powerful European sponsor. Ben-Gurion recorded a side meeting at Sèvres with French Prime Minister Guy Mollet in his diary. I told him about the discovery of a great deal of oil in southwestern Sinai, and that it is worthwhile to detach this peninsula from Egypt, for it does not belong to her. But the English had stolen it from the Turks when they thought that they had Egypt in their pocket. I proposed laying down an oil pipeline from Sinai to the refineries in Haifa, and Mollet expressed interest in this suggestion. During the 4 months between October 1956 and March 1957 that Israel occupied Sinai, the Geological Survey of Israel mapped the peninsula as they searched for oil with an eye to future control of the area. Once it was clear that the Eisenhower administration would insist on Israeli withdrawal from Sinai, the Israeli military looted pipes, pumps, and other equipment they found there to hobble Egyptian oil production, some of which found its way into the earlier, narrower version of the oil pipeline from Eilat. The Israeli military reoccupied the Sinai alongside the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and Golan in June 1967. In Sinai, Israel took over 117 offshore and onshore oil wells near Abu Radais on the Gulf of Suez. The wells had been operated since 1954 by a joint consortium of the Italian Eni and the Egyptian General Petroleum Corporation. As it reorientated in search for a powerful patron from the declining European empires to the United States, Israel left the oil fields of the American oil company undisturbed. If the country wanted to continue its territorial expansion and ensure a stable energy supply, it needed to do so under the US aegis. A 1972 CIA report on oil developments in Israel, which was declassified in 2011, confirmed that the stolen oil from Sinai had enabled Israel to hold its imports of oil from foreign countries below the pre-war level. The foreign exchange savings to Israel had been on the order of $25 million a year. In 1969, imports of crude oil from Sinai were about 2 million tons, and those from Iran a little over 3 million tons. Golda Meir visited Iran again in 1972. The Shah's confidant and Minister of Royal Court, Asadullah Alam, recorded the occasion in his secret diaries. He wrote, Thursday, 18th of May, audience. Golda Meir flew in at 7 this morning, and I reported that she was taking a short rest. The old woman has such stamina, His Imperial Majesty said. He then asked after the time of their meeting, which was scheduled after 3 p.m. She was received for around 2.5 hours before returning to the airport for her flight back to Israel. The 1972 visit was arranged 2 years after the death of Nasser of Egypt, who was loathed by the Shah and Israeli leaders, both for the military threat he presented and his popularity across the Third World. With Nasser gone, the Shah had developed a personal friendship with Anwar Sadat. During the meeting with Golda Meir, the Shah conveyed a message from Sadat requesting Israeli withdrawal from Sinai, which it had occupied since 1967. Since making those territorial gains, Israel had become dependent on the Egyptian oil it was illegally extracting in Sinai, and Meir chose to rebuff Sadat's ventures. A few months later, she hinted at the reason in a joke she told at a reception for the West German Chancellor Willy Brandt. She said, Moses took us 40 years through the desert in order to bring us to the one spot in the Middle East that has no oil. Rapprochement between Egypt and Israel would have required Israel to return Sinai to Egypt, permitted the reopening of Suez Canal, and downgraded the Eilat-Asqalon pipeline as an energy route and source of dollars. For months after her visit to Iran, Meir ignored a series of secret warnings from King Hussein of Jordan and the Shah of Iran about possible Egyptian retaliation. In a move that took Israel and Meir in particular by surprise, the Egyptian military crossed the Suez Canal and overran the supposedly invincible Bar-Lev line in October 1973. The repercussions of the initial roust of Israeli force were wide-ranging. Golda Meir was forced to resign a few months later, something Netanyahu has refused to do, when he was similarly surprised in October 2023. Golda Meir was succeeded by Yitzhak Rabin, who signed the separation of forces agreement with Egypt in May 1974. As evacuation from Sinai and the loss of its oil fields loomed, Rabin abruptly reversed Israel's opposition to apartheid South Africa and began negotiations over deliveries of coal from KwaZulu-Natal for new coal-powered electricity plants. Meanwhile, the dependence on Iranian oil as a source both of energy and foreign currency intensified. So much so that Israeli officials considered the rival Egyptian plan to link the Gulf of Suez and the Mediterranean a direct threat to their domination of the overland route and the flow of petrodollars from the oil traded through the Eilat-Asqalon pipeline. Financial Times reported that Tel Aviv must have felt extra piquancy at claiming that it had bombed a military installation in September 1969, when it had actually targeted a hotel full of civil engineers working on the Suez Iskandariya pipeline. Israel also signed a secret memorandum with the United States, which committed Washington to respond on an ongoing and long-term basis to Israel's military equipment and other defense requirements, and to its energy requirements, and to its economic needs. Basically, that agreement signed in 1970s makes Israel the United States' 51st state. A 1978 diplomatic cable from the US Embassy in Tel Aviv explicitly stated the reason. This country runs on oil and has no real short-term alternative. That is the reason it insisted in Sinai too on the US supply commitment. The extravagant annual transfers of oil, of US aid and armament to Israel was then institutionalized. In the decades that followed the Camp David Accords, Israel continued to receive secret shipments of oil from a now functioning spot market while expanding its coal-fired electric plants. It licensed oil companies to search unsuccessfully for oil in the Naqab, as well as in the West Bank and Jolan. Even after the Oslo Accords of 1993, which led to the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, Israel continued to search for energy in the occupied territories. In 1999, British Gas found vast reserves of natural gas off the coast from the Gazan shore, a field that is now known as the Gaza Marine. This was within 20 nautical miles of Gaza, a region that the Oslo Accord specified as Palestinian Maritime Economic Zone. With the discovery of the gas reserves, there has been successive Israeli efforts to shrink Palestinian access to the sea. First to 12 nautical miles in 2002, then 6 nautical miles after Hamas's election in Gaza in 2006, and finally to 3 nautical miles after Operation Cast Lead in 2008 and 9. While officially Palestinian fishermen are permitted to work within this 3-mile zone, the Israeli Navy has reduced this zone of access to 1 nautical mile by firing at will arbitrarily at Gazan fishermen. And of course, since the genocide in Gaza began, they've basically fired at anybody, even on the coast. Almost every month in 2023 before October, the Israeli Navy shot rubber bullets or live bullets at Palestinian fishermen, rammed their boats, or drove them back to shore using high-velocity jets of water. During the Israeli genocide against Gaza, one of the earliest targets of the Israeli Navy's bombing was the fleet of Palestinian fishing boats in Gaza. The complete Israeli control over Palestinian seas and its refusal to allow the Palestinian Authority or Hamas to make a deal with British gas on their terms led the company to abandon its plans to develop Gaza Marine. In 2009, a decade after Gaza Marine was discovered, Israel found reserves of gas in the Tamar and Leviathan fields further out to sea and up the coast. The Israeli national oil company Delek partnered with the Noble Energy of Oklahoma to exploit the two fields. Noble was later bought out by Chevron. In 2017, Jordan agreed to buy natural gas from Israel for its industrial facilities on the Dead Sea, thus indirectly financing the development of Tamar and Leviathan. The convergence on natural gas as the transitional fuel and the sabotage of Russia's Nord Stream pipelines to Germany have made the gas reservoirs in Europe's peripheries in Israel, Egypt, Algeria, Greece, Cyprus, and Norway all the more important. Tamar today provides 70% of Israeli energy needs, with the rest still covered by coal, now imported from Russia and Colombia. Leviathan's gas is almost entirely exported after it is shipped to Egypt for liquefaction and eventually hydrogen production. While Israel's Arab neighbors make a show of disapproval about its depredations against Palestinians, they quite happily make backroom energy deals away from their citizens' condemnatory scrutiny. In June 2023, Netanyahu's government announced that it had agreed with the Palestinian Authority to grant licenses for the development of Gaza Marine. It was clear that the policy was intended to shore up Mahmoud Abbas's regime in Ramallah, as the formal economic deal excluded Hamas. A proportion of the financial bounties of the deal was intended to trickle down to Gaza, thus effectively bribing Hamas into docility in Gaza. Then on 7 October 2023, Hamas militants broke through the Iron Wall, or as the Palestinian analyst Mouin Rabbani has called it, $1 billion physical, electronic, and digital barrier surrounding Gaza, murdered around 1,200 Israelis and foreigners, about a third of whom were military forces, and took hundreds hostage. The Israeli response was, of course, merciless. Even in the heat of the hostilities in November 2023, Israel granted 12 new licenses to BP and Eni to develop other fields near Leviathan, though not Gaza Marine. European hydrocarbon companies, which have seen some of their most profitable years in their entire history, are actively looking for new sources of gas close to Europe. The concession, which was given where in November there had been already 30,000 Palestinians killed, were Israel's means of reminding Europe that winter was coming. Europe, desperate to diversify its energy supply, would feel pressure to include Israel's natural gas among its sources. It remains to be seen whether Israel will now also expropriate Gaza Marine. It seems to me that by rolling back the Oslo Accords, Israel will try to get control over Gaza Marine. In 1989, the National Iranian Oil Company sued Israel in an arbitration court in Switzerland to force it to pay for cargoes of oil delivered just before the victory of the revolution between September and December 1978. In 2016, 27 years after the case was brought, the Iranians won more than $1 billion from Israel. But Israel has refused to acknowledge the validity of the judgment or pay Iran. In January 2023, the Knesset renewed its confidentiality order on Eilat Asqalon pipeline, which has been a secret in Israel since the 1960s. After Netanyahu signed the Abraham Accords between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Emirati oil has flown through the pipeline, which was built with Iranian money on Israeli soil. The Emirat are also a major investor in Israel's gas fields in the Mediterranean. Israeli trade through Bab el-Mandab was blockaded by Egypt in successive 20th century wars. In the third decade of the 21st century, the Ansar Allah in Yemen had effectively enforced the blockade on ships going to Israel through the strait. The Ansar Allah belonged to the Zaydi community of Yemen, whose imam in the 1960s was aided surreptitiously by Saudi Arabia and Israel to fight against Nasser of Egypt. Egypt, once the foremost enemy of Israel, is today led by General al-Sisi's government, which provides intelligence to and coordinates with Israel on security in Sinai and Gaza. Iran, once the most intimate ally of Israel in the region, is now its sworn enemy. South Africa, once the closest friend of Israel on the African continent, its primary source of coal and uranium, and its collaborator in developing and testing nuclear weapons, has dismantled apartheid and sued Israel at the International Court of Justice to hold it to account for genocidal violence in Gaza. In his analysis of settler colonialism, written in 1965, Palestinian scholar Faiz Saigh described the fate of Palestinians who are subjected to foreign domination, exploitation, and dispossession. The territory of Palestine is under alien rule. Its resources are exploited by others. Its people are exiles from their homeland. The remnants of its Arab inhabitants languish under a regime of racist discrimination and oppression as harsh as any race supremacist regime in Asia or Africa. All this has been accomplished by connivance with imperialism and by terror and violence. End quote. In the 6 decades since these words were written, more Palestinian territories have fallen under Israeli control. Deliberate policies of de-development have hardened Israel's grasp on Palestinian natural resources and economy. Where Palestinian communities, businesses, and life-sustaining infrastructures are not razed to the ground, they are remade to depend for their survival on Israel. Israel has insulated itself from international condemnation by becoming, in former US Secretary of State Alexander Haig's words, the largest unsinkable American aircraft carrier in the world. If this was once true, it may no longer be the case. European, especially unconditional German support for Israeli domination of Palestinians, as well as the more mundane trade in hydrocarbons acquired from and through Israel, have closely interwoven Israel into European energy networks. Today, Israel's future seems poised uncertainly between self-implosion and continued coddling by the Western powers. Given the carte blanche Israel has been accorded, it is not implausible that it will remain the US's gendarme in the region, consolidating and expanding its natural gas brokerage to Europe and its supine Arab allies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, لاله. شكرا لاله. I forgot to ask you if you understand Arabic.
I do understand Arabic, yes.
If not, you can switch to the channel in English, but we will have the discussion.
Okay.
We can ask in Arabic, and of course you can answer in English.
Okay.
So شكرا لاله كثير على المداخلة القيمة والغنية اللي فعلا هيك يعني فيها إضافة مهمة للمساق اللي مشينا فيه بالاقتصاد السياسي هون في بيرزيت في الفصل الأول. في شيء هيك يعني المقاربة أو الزاوية اللي أنت أشرت عليها هي بتأكد على أهمية الدوافع الإسرائيلية تجاه الطاقة، واللي يعني ناجمة عن هشاشة البنية الإسرائيلية أو الهشاشة أو التبعية بموضوع الطاقة. وقديش هاي الدوافع لها أهمية على خططها الاستيطانية الاستعمارية، على توسعها الإقليمي، على التحالفات والحروب كمان اللي قادتها إسرائيل في المنطقة. أنا بحب كمان أكد على أهمية المقاربة اللي بتعيد صياغة سياسة إسرائيل الاستعمارية ضمن سياق الإقليم الأوسع، وضمن كمان مسار تاريخي أطول اللي بيرجعنا قبل النكبة قبل 48، بدل من نحصر التحليل على السياسات الإسرائيلية في الضفة الغربية وقطاع غزة اللي يعني عادة يعني نسمع فيها. في شغلة كمان يعني حبيتها، اللي هي تسليط الضوء من خلال هاي عدسة الاستخراج الاكستراكتيفيزم والاستيلاء على موارد الطاقة، انه طبعا وهذا بيؤدي على السلب تجريد الفلسطينيين وشعوب المنطقة من مواردهم ومن أراضيهم. فاللي حبيته من هون يمكن نبدأ النقاش معك، انه ببين انه في هون دوافع استراتيجية، وانه هاي الدوافع الاستراتيجية تسبق الدوافع الربحية في الموضوع. مع انه انت طبعا بتشيري على انه دائما اسرائيل بسبب الموازين القوى اللي اسرائيل عم تستفيد منها بالمنطقه، يعني بالاخر كمان بتصبح مربحه لها. بس انا سؤالي هون، هل هو دائما الحال؟ يعني دائما الدوافع الربحيه يعني بتكمل على الدوافع الاستراتيجيه، او ممكن كمان من المفيد انه نوضح كيف مش بالضروره هاي الدوافع الاستراتيجيه تكون مربحه، وقد تكون مكلفه لاسرائيل او لحلفائها. فهذا فمهم انه يعني هل مهم انه نقدر نفصل بين الدوافع الاستراتيجيه والدوافع الربحيه، او لانه اللي قدمتيه مبين انه هم قريبين من بعض. النقطه الثانيه كمان اللي اهتميت فيها كمان ببين من خلاله، وهذا الشيء انا يعني كنت بحب دائما اكد عليه في شغلي بالاقتصاد السياسي، كيف كمان على جانب المنطق الربحي والتراكمي، يعني تراكم راس المال، في كمان انت عم بتشيري بلحظه من اللحظات على جانب كمان يعني له علاقه في بعد استراتيجي، كيف اسرائيل على جنب السلب الموارد كمان اشتغلت على دمج شعوب المنطقه، يعني الشعب الفلسطيني وشعوب المنطقه، دمجهم في الشبكه والبنيه التحتيه استراتيجيه يعني اسرائيليه من ناحيه الطاقه، وانه كيف هذا الدمج كان مصمم استراتيجيا بمنطق انه يصبح السلاح بايد اسرائيل بنوع من اللي بسموه مكافحه التمرد، كونتر انسرجنسي، او يعني سلاح ضد المقاومه. فهل ممكن كمان تتوسع شوي اكثر بهذا الموضوع، بهذا الجانب اللي هو كيف ممكن الطاقه تصبح سلاح كمان مستخدم ضد شعوب المنطقه لما يصبحوا هم تابعين لاسرائيل بهذا الشيء. وحاكتفي هون انا بهذول السؤالين. شكرا لك كمان مره. بعرفش اذا بتحبي نوسع شوي ناخذ كمان اسئله، او بتحبي تبلشي بالجواب على هذول الاسئلتين زي ما بتحبي.
Okay. So the first question is about the interconnection between the interconnection between strategic and profit motives, I think, is fairly obvious. My entire career has been an argument about how these two things are inseparable from one another. I think in some ways I follow the writings of Rosa Luxemburg, who in her Accumulation of Capital argues that imperial power works not only through the expansion of financial or economic force, but especially through military force. And one of the things that Rosa Luxemburg shows in Accumulation of Capital, which she wrote at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, is that everything, and she actually specifically talks about the Suez Canal. She specifically talks about railways, railway construction in Egypt and Argentina. And she says that these infrastructures are incredibly crucial to both empires' strategic needs, because the railways and the canal can be used for ships, and they're also incredibly crucial for its economic needs, because of course those transportation infrastructures help the profit motive and the accumulation of capital. And that has been seen absolutely everywhere. We are seeing now this interconnection between strategic and political economic in the Strait of Hormuz, for example, where Iran, which is asymmetrically, it doesn't have as much power as the US or Israel, and it cannot hit the US or Israel as much as they have hit Iran, but it does have this control over the Strait of Hormuz, which is at once an economic and a strategic area. And so I think this connection has to be acknowledged, because I think that strategic struggles, or those that are military forms of struggle, are incredibly significant to the political economy. And as we have seen, as I tried to show in this paper, Israel considers energy needs as part of its security or strategic needs. And a lot of its decision making, for example, about occupying Jolan, for example, in occupying Sinai, were actually about oil. So that has to be recognized. The relationship that Israel had with Iran was not only about encircling the Arab world. Iran, Turkey, and Ethiopia was not only about encircling the Arab world, but it was also about access to energy. So this connection between the profit motive and the strategic motive has been there forever. I think the second question that you asked was, what is like the aim of, please correct me if I'm wrong, but what is the aim of strategic aims or weapons of Israel in terms of both counterinsurgency and in terms of de-development? And I think that is fairly clear in the case of the West Bank, certainly clear in the case of Gaza. And it is about a policy of de-development of the economy as a modality of preventing the possibility of strategic struggle. I think we know that people often can organize when they have the ability, whether economic or otherwise, to actually gather and form some kind of mobilizational, whether through armed struggle or through mass movements. And one of the plans that Israel has had, again from the beginning, has been an uneven assignment of economic goods, if you will, everything from electricity, access to electricity and water, to production capabilities, to export capabilities, to those kinds of infrastructures, and considering those to be strategic to it. So again, we saw that in the 1956 occupation of Sinai, and then the much longer occupation of Sinai after the 1967 war, we see that the Israelis not only took over infrastructure in Sinai, but also looted Sinai oil equipment and brought them to Israel. We see that in the way that the Israeli state, whenever it has taken over any of its neighboring states' territories, it has used them economically. As I mentioned, it has always coveted the area up to the Litani River in Lebanon. And every time that it has invaded the country, once in the 1970s, once in the 1980s, and again now, it has tried to get control of the Litani River. Those energy needs are really important, but also in the areas that it controls, de-development has been crucial for it. So it has aimed to destroy the possibility of any kind of political economic development in order to ensure that they the Palestinians cannot develop their own economy, and so this is something that I think we see across the history of Israeli presence in the region.
شكرا لاله. إذا في أسئلة, if you have any question.
It seems Basil, Dr. Qassan Abu Hattab is online who would like to ask a question.
كان في حدا online or we can start here on the no. So حنبلش هون we are starting in the here. Oh, okay. So please Dr. Hassan, تفضل. دكتور حسن.
دكتور حسن مش سامعينك. We can't hear you.
مسموع؟ ما بعرف مسموع
هيك انه احنا مسموعين.
شكرا كثير على هي المعلومات الغنية. بس هو يعني سؤالي له علاقة بانه ينضاف للشيء اللي استعرضتيه. النقطة الأولى يمكن بحب أضيف أو إنه مسموع. بعرفش قديش برضه كمان إذا بنقدر نضيف موضوع المي للطاقة. موضوع المي موضوع رئيسي. الشغلة الثانية اللي هو يعني في عدة مشاريع عمليا اللي وخاصة بغزة، يعني مشروع ريتش اللي توقع اتفاقية الغاز مثلا، واللي كانت السلطة الفلسطينية شريكة في موضوع استخراج الغاز بشكل بريطانية ريتش على ما أعتقد. كمان في اتفاقية الغاز اللي مع الأردن، وكمان شوي بحب أعرف عن مشروع قناة البحرين، لأنه هذا مشروع كثير كبير وكثير انحكى عن الامتداد كمان الإقليمي في موضوع مشروع قناة البحرين. أنا بعتقد إنه إحنا إذا بدنا نربط أكيد يعني بالنسبة لي هناك في ربط ما بين احتلال والاستعمار والدور والرأسمالي والربع، لأنه يعني حتى من القمع عمليا ينتهي. بالتالي بكل هاي الأشكال، فحابة إنه يعني هاي الإضافات أسمع رأيك في هاي المشاريع هذول. وفي موضوع المي تحديدا اللي بعتقد إنه إضافة للطاقة، كمان موضوع المي من المواضيع اللي كثير مهم، وكيف إسرائيل عمليا عم تتوسع في كل المنطقة للسيطرة على المي. وأعتقد إنه حتى بيرس في كتاب الشرق الأوسط الجديد تحدث يعني كان عن إنه مستقبل الصراع على المي في المنطقة. شكرا.
Those are absolutely incredibly important and crucial questions. And I very passingly mentioned the question of water. I think one of the things that I'm actually really looking forward right now to is finding a PhD student who can read Hebrew and who can do some research in the archives of Israel, because one of the things that has become clear to me is the extent to which the construction of desalination plants in Israel were used in the 1950s and 60s in order to develop, number one, energy infrastructures in Israel, but importantly, actually to develop nuclear weapons. So if you actually do some research in the United States archives, what becomes clear is that there are all these discussions in the 1950s around Israeli desalination plants to make water for agriculture. But in fact, what they're thinking about in order to, because desalination requires a lot of energy, is they supposedly put up a nuclear power plant, which the French helped them to do in order to produce water. So I think that there is obviously a very close relationship between between water and energy production, and in this instance also Israeli nuclear weapons. So I think that question is really important in that sense. It is also really important because we see that rivers, particularly the Litani, the Auja, the Jordan River, have been used not only as economic sources, so for hydroelectric power production, for irrigation, etc., but they're also importantly used as strategic spaces, so as strategic boundaries that Israel constantly wishes to control. And I think that, again, we see that being really important. Additionally, part of the reason that the Israel sort of has been trying to consolidate its hold over the West Bank, it has annexed Jolan, is because these are major sources of water. I don't have to tell you guys that one of the biggest points of contention between Israel and the negotiators, Palestinian negotiators during Oslo, and then again during the Gaza Ariha, was actually the question of water, which has never been settled. And again, I don't have to tell you that while the settlers fill their pools with Palestinian water is constantly cut off. So there is this element also of water usage being important. That water usage is also something that you see being a point of contention incredibly significantly in Iraq, and of course, in the Arabian Peninsula, which is one of the most arid places on Earth. Again, this desalination plants, the connection between desalination plants and energy production is incredibly important there. And we saw that, for example, when the US and Israel attacked a desalination plant in Iran attacked desalination plants in Kuwait, and I think in Bahrain as well. So these are the question of water is incredibly important. The second question that you asked was about the role of the Palestinian Authority alongside Israel in Gaza Marine, I think, and the role also of the Arab states in financing Israeli natural gas production. As I mentioned, before the Abraham Accords even, Jordan and Egypt were very crucial in this process. So what we saw was that Jordan signed the contract with Israel to buy whatever natural gas it produced out of its gas fields, which are near Haifa, so off the coast of Haifa. And by doing so, by guaranteeing an income for Israel for the natural gas, which it needed for Jordan needed for phosphate production by the Red Sea, it basically financed the development of those fields. That was one thing. Egypt has been incredibly crucial, not only because there's an exchange of natural gas goes on between them. Egyptians buy Israeli natural gas, Israelis buy Egyptian natural gas, but also Egypt has a series of facilities for liquefaction of natural gas, which Israel does not have. So Israel actually sends a lot of its natural gas to Egypt to produce liquefied natural gas, which is then exported. So that's the second. And then, of course, since Abraham Accords, we've seen that Abu Dhabi in particular, the Emirat, has made major investments in Israeli natural gas. In all of this, of course, natural gas is used as a kind of a weapon of counterinsurgency or economic counterinsurgency, if you will, because by withholding the possibility of the development of Gaza Marine and basically using its clients in Ramallah to do what it wants to do, Israel has prevented the development of those fields, even though supposedly there have been licenses given, I think, to the British Petroleum to develop those fields. That has not happened. There are also shared fields which between Israel and Lebanon. And one of the big points of contention between Israel and Hezbollah was the development of those fields and who would get to use them. And the deal that was signed for them to share those fields has basically acted to the benefit of Israel, because Israel already had deals going on with Total Energy of France to exploit those fields. And so these shared fields are basically being depleted by Israel. These shared fields are also really important in the way that it's creating new alliances between Israel and Cyprus on the one side and Greece on the other side. What we're finding is that Greece, which used to be quite a radical friend of Palestinians, is becoming one of the major supporters of Israel in the EU. And so this natural gas is the basis of these incredible developments across the region.
شكرا. في سؤال على الشات من الدكتور غسان، هو متواجد في غزة وبيحكي لنا الانترنت بطيء، يعني مش جيد. فالسؤال من الدكتور غسان هو كالتالي: هل ما زالت عوامل تعثر ولادة شرق أوسط جديد كما هي منذ بن غوريون حتى نتنياهو الآن، أم أن هناك عوامل وفواعل جديدة ظهرت مع الإبادة بغزة؟
Yes, that's a brilliant question. Because, as I said, one of the things that really surprised me, so I come from a left-wing communist family in Iran, right? From the very beginning, my family was pro-Palestinian. George Habash was a hero in our household, and we knew, like the group that my parents were part of were had very close connections to Jabha, and despite all of that, when I discovered that every single Israeli prime minister had visited Iran under the Shah, I was completely surprised. It blew me away, because there is this history that we don't know. There's a history that we don't know about the connections that Israel, the secret connections that Israel has built with these different states. And one of the things that the Israeli genocide in Gaza has caused is a reassessment of the relationships that Israel has in the broader global South, and then the US and Israeli attack against Iran and the Iranian response has caused a reassessment of Israel's location in the Arab world. So the way that I see this is that across the world, I mean, everywhere that you go, Israel has lost huge amounts of legitimacy. The problem is that there's what I would call a democratic deficit. So every institution is pro-Palestinian, but the leaders of every institution is pro-Israel. In universities, the students and the staff are pro-Palestinian. The leadership of universities are pro-Israel. In newspapers, reporters are pro-Palestinian. Editors are pro-Israel. Governments, the people are pro-Palestinian. They're out on the street. But the people are out on the street, but the governments are pro-Israel. So you see this everywhere. And then in the global south, you see that people basically, the youth certainly, but actually across the different communities, Israel has lost a huge amount of legitimacy. What is interesting is, of course, that in the Arab world, there has been this concerted effort by both the United States and Israel itself to more and more embed Israel in relations with the Arab states. And these relations are economic, as I described, but they are also diplomatic. And so what we saw, for example, the fact that Netanyahu declared that he had secretly visited Abu Dhabi along with the head of Mossad and the head of Israeli military. But what was interesting to me was not that Israel declared this. It was interesting that the Emiratis denied this. That means that there is quite a lot of disagreement about the role that Israel is playing. We also hear rumors, and of course these are rumors because these are opaque states. We're hearing rumors about there being major disagreements between different Emirats in the Emirati Federation. So we hear, for example, that the Emir of Sharjah is unhappy with the position that Abu Dhabi has taken. And there's, for example, we see that the Sheikh Mohammed of Dubai is subtweeting somebody. We don't know who he's subtweeting. We don't know if he's subtweeting the Emir of Sharjah or the Emir of Dubai, Abu Dhabi. So there's all sorts of things going on also in the Gulf. The fact that Saudi Arabia has come out, for example, denying that they're willing to collaborate with Abu Dhabi. I think all of these are major realignments. The fact that Egypt and Qatar, for example, are involved in whatever this deal is that is going to be made between Iran and the US seems to me also quite significant. All of this does not necessarily benefit Palestinians. I have to say this. And the reason that I don't think it necessarily benefits Palestinians is because we know that since the beginning, basically, the United States has depended on Israel as its gendarme in the region, and also on these conservative, right-wing monarchies and pro-US imperialist regimes. And as long as these regimes are in power, Palestinians are not going to get the support that they need from the Arab states. The question is, how can this be challenged? And my sense is that there really needs to be some way that Israel is censured globally in order for its power to be pulled back a little bit. I don't know if that's possible. I don't know how that might happen, but it is something that is absolutely necessary.
في كمان سؤال بس احكي ملاحظه فعلا هو عن جد مثير هذا التاريخ، يعني تاريخ انه العلاقات الصهيونيه الايرانيه وتتبعه، يعني يمكن ربما هو تاريخ كمان غير مكتوب. ما بعرفش هلا ايش كان عندك صعوبات ضغط هذا التاريخ جديد، يعني هل هذه معلومات متاحه بشكل يعني وافر حول العلاقات الايرانيه الاسرائيليه بتحديد هذه الزيارات، ولا هيك بس هذا فضول عام صراحه؟ في سؤال على الشات من فيروز اقراه. تحاول إسرائيل استغلال الحرب الحالية والعمل على بناء خطوط نفط ممتدة من الدول العربية تمر عبر فلسطين المحتلة. السؤال هو كالتالي: هل ممكن أن تكون خطط الإمداد هذه ضمن الخطط الاستراتيجية المستقبلية؟ وهل تحميها من أي انهيارات مستقبلية بخصوص مجال الطاقة؟ إذا مش واضح لا بعينه.
That's a very good question. I mean, I think that Israeli control over energy has been one of its fundamental and most significant attempts, something that has not really been studied extensively And it has been one of the most important things that Israel has wanted to do since even before the formation of since even before the Nakba. So I think that it's one of the ways that it guarantees its security. It considers its security to be dependent on these energy sources, and so it's really, that is one of the things that has been very crucial to its security. One of the things that is often forgotten is that during the time that the Fedayeen were struggling against the state of Israel, during the period of armed struggle between 1967, after the Battle of Karama, one of the things that the various Palestinian Fedayeen groups would engage in was the sabotage of Israeli of pipelines carrying energy to Israel. So sabotage of energy sources was always really important. When Hezbollah would try to attack, for example, some of the natural gas platforms in the Mediterranean, that is the moment that Israel actually entered negotiations over the use of those gas fields with Lebanon. So these energy sources are so central to Israeli survival that some method of finding of sabotaging them, or of essentially cutting off Israeli access to them is probably going to be incredibly crucial in forms of struggle against them. I don't know how that can be done, because some of the world's biggest oil companies are major investors in this. I've already mentioned Total and Chevron and the Emiratis, ADNOC, but it is something that should be considered.
معرفش إذا في كمان أسئلة تحبوا تسألوها.
أنا عندي سؤال بس بعرفش إذا كيف ممكن نقدر نفهم الإجراء الأخير على إيران، إنه هل هو محاولة لإعادة إنتاج أو إعادة تشكيل سوق النفط، بالأخص بعد انسحاب حوارات من الإيباي وبداية الحديث عن علاقات إماراتية إسرائيلية وتعاون في مجال النفط؟
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your question. Is it about the market? Is it about the Iranian oil market and a new oil market that could potentially exclude Israel? Was that the question?
لا، هو بعد يعني أثناء العدوان الإيراني، أثناء العدوان الإسرائيلي الأمريكي على إيران، هل يمكن فهمهم بأنه هو إعادة تشكيل للسوق في مجال النفط، بالأخص يعني بعد ما انسحبت الإمارات من إيباك، بداية ظهور بداية الحديث عن علاقات إماراتية إسرائيلية في هذا المجال؟ ممكن هل هناك توجه لأنه يكون في منظمات نفطية بعد موازية
Yeah, okay, I got that. Okay, so Emirat pulling out of the OPEC is not as significant, I think, an action as everybody took it to be. So one of the things that is forgotten is that when Emirat and Saudi Arabia basically surrounded Qatar in 2015 and tried to pressure Qatar pulled out of OPEC. And part of the reason that I think the Emirat pulled out of OPEC was because it thought that it could use its pipeline between Abu Dhabi, which is on the Persian Gulf, Khalij Fars, to the Fujairah, which is in Khalij Oman. It thought that it could use that pipeline to take oil over to Fujairah and then pump as much oil as it can without the OPEC caps or OPEC limits. But of course, Iranians immediately attacked Fujairah. And so I don't think that and also Emirat Abu Dhabi has announced that it is going to expand that pipeline, because at the moment the capacity of that pipeline is only 1.5 million barrels per day. and the amount of oil that goes through Hormuz is 20 million barrels, or did go through Hormuz before the war, was 20 million barrels per day. So it doesn't matter how big they make that pipeline, it's just not going to be enough. So that's the first thing to mention. The second thing is, can an oil market be remade? And I find it, I mean, I would love to be able to say yes. I mean, wars have this effect where they cause structural changes that are unanticipated. So we know that, for example, the US Israeli war on Iran has caused a major reassessment of the US military capabilities, and what that might mean economically and strategically for the United States is quite significant. We also know that the war has also caused people questioning the possibility of a credible alternative to the dollar, as because up to now and even now everybody has accepted the dollar is going to be the primary currency for global trade, for the purchase of petroleum, and dollar channels that the US controls, like SWIFT, for example, are the way that the US uses coercion economically against its enemies. But what this war has done has shown that if the US goes too far in using these channels, other powers are going to start looking to other possibilities, to other alternatives, to the dollar channel. So looking, for example, to the Chinese renminbi or to cryptocurrencies as a possible replacement. So whether an oil market and a different kind of oil market can emerge is a difficult question to ask for all of these reasons. All of these factors go into it. The other thing that I think is really important that we don't forget is that the oil market is not made just by the producers, right? It isn't just made by an Iran or an Abu Dhabi or Saudi Arabia or even the US, whose oil companies are right now supplying the world and are having a major amount of windfall profit. They're also made by traders, oil traders, commodities traders whose names we may not even know, like Vitol or Trafigura. These are companies whose names are unfamiliar to most people, but they are incredibly crucial in the circulation of oil. Mark Rich, who I talked about at length in my talk, is one of these figures. He is, in fact, like the father of this new oil trading market. And so these oil trading markets are also a factor. Finally, the other thing that I think is important is that one of the things that we've noticed is that because of this shortage of oil in the global markets, one of the things that has happened is that we're seeing a lot of countries and companies turning towards other kinds of energy. Obviously, China benefits because China is at the forefront of green or sustainable energy, like battery production, for example, for solar or for wind. But it's important to also note that a lot of countries have actually turned to coal. So you're having a return not only to future sources of energy, but also a return to coal. So that's also a factor. And in fact, one of the things also that might be a counterintuitive effect of the Iranian closure of Hormuz and the Ras Al Khaimah gas processing in Qatar, one of the unintended effects of that is, of course, that Israeli gas, which is in the Mediterranean, is going to be much more easily available now to the Europeans. So there's all sorts of contradictory things happening here, which is at the moment really difficult to tell which direction they might go.
سؤال، إذا ما في أسئلة أنا عندي كمان هيك سؤال. هو سؤالي شوي يمكن برجعنا لورا أو كنوع من الاستخلاص، يعني يمكن لشغلك لاله بهالمرحلة الجديدة. يعني أنا حابب نربط شوي بين هذا الشغل حول الاستخراجية والشغل اللي عملتيه سابقا حول الطرق اللوجستية والبحار في المنطقة. كيف هذا الشغل الجديد بيعيد التفكير بالأسئلة اللي كنت طرحتيها سابقا بأي شكل؟ يعني كيف كنت بتربطي السؤال حول الاستخراجية مع الأسئلة اللي حول الطرق اللوجستية؟ وشو كيف ممكن نفهم موقع إسرائيل في هذا العمل؟ يعني اللي انت قدمتي لنا اليوم ببين انه اسرائيل الى مكانه خاصه في النظام الرأسمالي العالمي، مش بس كقاعده عسكريه للغرب في منطقتنا، ولكن كمان كحلقه وصل لوجستيه، ممكن كبنيه تحتيه موجوده في منطقتنا اللي دورها كمان انه توصل المنطقه في الاسواق العالميه والاستخراج العالمي. فإذا فيك هيك شوي تستخلص الموضوع وتحكي لنا شو. شكرا لك.
That's a fantastic question. Obviously, I mean, this has been basically what I've argued for the last decade, is that capitalism absolutely requires logistical circulatory processes in order for it to function. And so what we're seeing, for example, is that any economy that has this logistical power, the logistical infrastructures, ports or roads or transport infrastructures, is capable of embedding itself in the heart of global economy. Now, one of the things that is is a factor here is that the kind of okay. Let me start again. So Israel is interesting in that logistical sense, in that it is better embedded in an India-centered logistical network, which has become a kind of a rival to the Chinese Belt and Road infrastructures. India is, through the company Adani, is trying to become a significant global logistical node. And Adani, as you know, has bought a concession to the port of Haifa, where we thought that China was going to get that concession, but Adani ended up getting that. We also know that there is a deal called I2U2, I, India, Israel, U2, United Arab Emirates, United States of America, which is both a commercial and a strategic deal between these four actors. And the commercial elements include extraction, they include manufacturing, and they include logistics. And at the heart of this is, of course, Dubai and the port of Jebel Ali, and also Adani and its expanding empire across the globe. Because Adani is not only also a major logistics, but it's also a major producer of coal from India. So, and of course, Israel still has something like 17 to 18% of its energy needs that come from coal. So there are all these factors that are significant. But Israel itself is not, although Zim, the company, the shipping company Zim, is one of the top 10, I think, shipping companies in the world, it is not itself considered to be a very significant logistical power. In part because it has focused primarily, the focus of its ports and transport infrastructure has been primarily domestic rather than external. I have a friend, Shari Plonsky, who's working on how Israel is trying to get itself embedded in regional networks, but it is doing so through rail and road rather than through shipping. And that this is also serves a dual purpose for Israel, because when, exactly like hydroelectric power lines, if you have railways and roads going through Palestinian areas, then what you could do is you could police those Palestinian areas scenarios. You could use your railroad and railways and roads as an excuse actually for counterinsurgency against Palestinians. This is also something that Israel has done even before the Nakba, or the Jewish settlers have done even before the Nakba. So I think in that sense, the logistical networks of Israel tend to be less maritime and more land-based. But Israel does have the Zim Shipping Company, and Zim Shipping Company has been not only a major commercial shipping company, we also know that Zim has been used whenever Israel has needed sort of a ship for its Mossad operations. When Mordechai Vanunu, for example, was kidnapped in Italy, he was brought to Israel on board a Zim ship. Whenever Mossad engages in activities elsewhere, Zim ships are somehow involved. And so this role is also unsurprising, because I think the place of Israel in global political economy is really through its surveillance, military, and coercive technologies, whether that's shipping or software development or weaponry technologies. It is basically a little Sparta. It basically locates itself, it makes itself necessary to the production of armament and surveillance software. And part of the reason that Abu Dhabi loves Israel is because it allows it to purchase the kind of surveillance mechanisms that it needs. In fact, the reason that all of these Gulf monarchies love Israel is because they can all buy these softwares and weaponry in order to suppress the populations that make these countries as rich as they are.
تفضل. في كمان سؤال؟
احكي وعشان هو شوية
بختم لا ممكن تضل معنا، يعني نختم بشكل رسمي، تضل معنا بس دقيقتين. Is this fine? We can stick with us for 2 more minutes.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, definitely. Sorry, yes.
So, شكرا كثير لاله، وشكرا للجميع على حضوركم. إذا ما في كمان أسئلة بدنا نختم، ونرجع نحن بنلتقي كمان شهر بالجلسة الأخيرة للسيمينار. لالي عن جد شكرا كمان مرة كثير لك، كانت عن جد جلسة غنية ومهمة اليوم. يعطيكم العافية. بدنا نحن